So far in this series, we've seen nukes lost at sea alone. Whether it was an emergency detonation over the frozen North Pacific or a wayward H-bomb strapped to a lost Navy fighter jet, both incidents I've examined so far have been relatively far from population centers. But have there ever been nukes lost near civilians? Maybe even within the continental United States? Nukes in any context are horrifying, and a lost nuke is an absolute nightmare no matter where it happens. But I don't think it gets any scarier than a hydrogen bomb lost in the middle of the civilized world. And oh yeah, it's definitely happened before. The first such incident happened way back in 1958 in South Carolina, but it wouldn't be the last. 3 years later, yet another era would break over a quaint farm town called Faro, North Carolina, near Goldsboro. It was a time when war tensions had never been higher, when U.S. leaders were more brazen than ever, and when change was looming close beyond the horizon. The need for readiness and perfect timing was essential, and the Air Force made every feasible accommodation to meet that need. Hundreds of American bombers crisscrossed the skies over the Arctic Circle, over the Atlantic Ocean, and over the United States itself. On January 23, 1961, 8 men embarked from Seymour Johnson Air Force Base on Keep 19, a B-52 bomber. This bomber carried not one, but two 3.8 megaton hydrogen bombs, both destined to become broken arrows.
There is only world peace where there is power to preserve order among nations. And the retaliatory power of the Strategic Air Command of the United States Air Force is the greatest deterrent to general war there is in the world today. Some are always airborne along special routes, ready for orders that would send them to their target. And to be confident World War III can't be triggered by unauthorized launching of a nuclear bomb.
Back in 1950, Ship 2075 crashed near British Columbia, having jettisoned its inert nuclear payload over the North Pacific, detonating the fissile materials harmlessly over the waves. Ship 2075 was a B-36 intercontinental strategic bomber designed to bomb targets on the other side of the world from air bases across the country. The bomber was flown by Air Force pilots who were part of an elite military unit known as SAC, the Strategic Air Command. SAC's purview was strategic bombing, most importantly with nuclear weapons. In 1950, the job of SAC was relatively straightforward. The Russians had a big army, and SAC was charged with deterring a European invasion by threat of nuclear retaliation. Russia didn't have many nukes back then, having only just popped off their first in 1948, so nuclear weapons were seen as a trump card to Soviet aggression. But all that would change during the 50s, with the Soviets getting more and more nuclear weapons as the decade progressed, including the dreaded ICBM. If America was all about bombers, the USSR was all about rockets. And by the end of the 1950s, they had produced the world's first ICBM and shown it off to the world in style when that same rocket carried Sputnik into the heavens in 1957. This rapid technological expansion and equally rapid arms growth meant a more urgent need for SAC, which in turn meant a more urgent need for defense funding. The military budget ballooned big time in the 50s, allowing the Air Force to outfit SAC with the best of the best in military tech. The bombs got bigger, the planes got more advanced and more numerous, and SAC bases grew from only 23 back in 1950 to 52 in 1961.
Let's show these freaks what a bloated, runaway military budget can do.
A whole nation's worth of red fear had been poured into the U.S. nuclear force, with SAC shouldering the lion's share of responsibility in guarding the USA. SAC's leader at the time of Ship 2075's doomed flight was General Curtis LeMay, a man I mentioned so often he could almost be the mascot of the channel. But if anyone knows anything about LeMay, they would likely question that move. LeMay was a polarizing figure, the kind of guy who was right for his specific job, the job of making war from the air. Nobody understood the potential of strategic bombing better than he did, and he was a natural fit for SAC, at least at first glance. LeMay, like so many other warriors in history, was an aggressive, stubborn warmonger, thirsty for combat and only interested in one thing: total victory over his enemies. LeMay was given a large amount of leeway in planning for the apocalypse, and his strategy of choice was massive retaliation, throwing every nuclear weapon we have available right at Russia's face at the merest slight. Under LeMay's command, the U.S. Air Force would be ready to strike at Russia at any time, at any place, and with every ounce of apocalyptic fury in the arsenal. To accommodate this need, LeMay would require ground crews to be ready at lightning speed. Back in 1950, crews would require about 6 hours to get a B-36 into the air, but even 3 hours wasn't good enough for LeMay, especially when the world found out that the USSR could get an ICBM on its way in as little as 15 minutes. So that became the target for the SAC fleet, wheels up and heading toward Moscow in 15 minutes or less. But soon enough, even this lofty goal would be too slow for LeMay. If the ICBMs were pointed at our SAC bases like we knew they would be, it likely wouldn't matter how fast a bomber could get off the tarmac, as the skies around the runway would be burning with nuclear fire. No, the only real choice was constant and consistent vigilance, with planes in the air 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
The intercontinental ballistic missile is now a grim reality. It cuts warning time from hours to minutes. Therefore, the Strategic Air Command must keep a force in the air around the clock.
Thus, the Airborne Alert System was born. By 1960, SAC was maintaining an average of 122 aircraft in the sky in perpetuity, including bombers and tankers for aerial refueling. This would ensure that at all times, the U.S. would be ready to deploy nuclear bombers to not only retaliate, but even preemptively strike at the USSR.
In addition, some are always airborne along special routes, ready for orders that would send them to their target.
The Peacemaker, with all of its faults, was not long for the world of strategic bombing. A task as monumentally important as protecting America from nuclear annihilation demanded a bigger, better, and above all, more reliable aircraft. SAC wanted it all, an airframe big enough to carry the utmost in world-ending technology at a speed nearly double that of the Peacemaker. Their plane would need to be rugged, tough, and stalwart in the face of even the most rigorous of schedules. And LeMay and SAC would get all of that and more in the mighty B-52 Strato Fortress. Volumes of books and countless hours of documentary footage have been dedicated to this legendary aircraft, so though I wish I could, I will refrain from expounding too much on its many merits. What follows is a brief technical and historical background for the uninitiated, with a focus on the facts that pertain to our particular vehicle in question, the B-52 G model. Boeing churned out the first B-52 for the U.S. Air Force in 1955, having won a contract bid in 1946. The plane went through various design changes over the testing period, having begun life as a straight-wing prop plane. Somewhere along the line, the 52 got a tandem fighter jet-style cockpit in the same vein as the ill-fated B-47, but LeMay himself requested a side-by-side airline-style cockpit to increase visibility for the co-pilot and to promote crew comfort. The Air Force had found their bomber in the B-52, and they would order hundreds of them over the coming decade, with Boeing developing new variants by the year. The changes the B-52 would see reflected the growing preponderance of electronic warfare and SAC's need for extra-long flight times for the Airborne Alert program. The Strato Fortress was one of the earliest aircraft with a specified seat for the Electronic Warfare Officer, or EDUB. The EDUB was in charge of electronic countermeasures, specifically dealing with guided missiles and enemy radar systems. This aspect of war was in its infancy back in 1961, but the EDUB position would grow in importance exponentially as technology and warfare expanded. The EDUB was segregated in the back of the plane for most of the B-52's variants, but with the G model, he finally got to sit up front. In fact, all of the crew was seated in the front half of the plane, and this was a good thing too, as it allowed for quicker scrambling on the tarmac and quicker bailouts should the need arise. Air Force personnel would christen the B-52 with its most long-lasting nickname, Buff, or Big Ugly Fat Fellow. And though she was a thick bird, that didn't mean there was much legroom in the crew compartments. Many of the crew positions were tucked into tight corners with no view outside, just you and your instruments. And though the Buff could fly with a crew of 6, oftentimes multiple ride-alongs would need seating as well. The third pilot had a seat in the cockpit, though with an obstructed view, and the other ride-along would get the worst seat in the house, dubbed the Instructor Navigator seat. The IN was the most cramped seat in the most cramped compartment known as the hole. Under the IN's feet was a metal grating under which all manner of spilled refuse eventually ended up, from chemicals and lubricants to coffee and, bodily emissions. But worse than bad smells and obstructed views, both ride-along seats were devoid of ejection mechanisms, meaning in the case of a bailout, the occupants would need to jump out the old-fashioned way, through the escape hatches left by the recently ejected crew. The G model was the first of the wet wing B-52s, meaning that fuel was stored partially in the sealed wing structure. In fact, the G model was designed to carry something like 42,000 extra gallons of fuel, all in an effort to allow the rigorous, often 24-hour-long missions required for SAC. Wet wings are not uncommon in the aeronautics world, and many civilian aircraft use integral fuel tanks, but they do require intensive maintenance against sealant deterioration and metal fatigue.
This is called foreshadowing.
Nestled behind the rear crew compartments is the massive bomb bay, in which could be carried a payload of up to 50,000 pounds of bombs. These bombs could be conventional explosives a la the Vietnam War, but in our case, they were two Mark 39 thermonuclear bombs. The W-39 warhead delivered a blast yield of 3.8 megatons, the largest weapon we've covered in this series in terms of explosive power. These beasts could level a city center in moments, with anything within a 2-kilometer radius being instantly vaporized. These are the weapons that would end the world, the ones that make the Fat Man look like a firecracker. The bombs were loaded into the B-52 under strict supervision, just like with the B-36 and the Mark IV, and the process for deploying a nuke was stringent and precise to avoid accidental apocalypse. There was also a series of safety mechanisms included within and without, but we'll get into those a little later. The B-52 is a symposium in itself on the concept of good design, adaptability, and freaking longevity. Buffs have flown with the US Air Force since 1955, and by some accounts, they'll still be with us up until the 2050s. An Air Force pilot once said, "It may not be your father's Air Force, but it might just be his airplane." And nowadays, it is our grandfathers that flew these stalwart war machines first, with every solitary B-52 amongst the 76 still in service having been built by the end of 1962. But 744 were built in total, and not all of them passed from decommissioning. And for as reliable as the Buff was, it wasn't perfect, and sometimes a little oversight is all it takes to cause a catastrophic failure.
In order to guard against surprise nuclear attack, America's Strategic Air Command maintains a large force of B-52 bombers airborne 24 hours a day.
In 1961, Crew R-10 of Keep 19 prepared to embark on yet another important test flight, one designed to emulate the southern route of Operation Chrome Dome. Chrome Dome was the code name for a set of airborne alert missions that rotated constant B-52 presence on 3 different routes near the Soviet border. Keep 19 would be flying a route within the continental US that mirrored the proposed flight path of the southern route, that would see bombers crossing the Atlantic into the Mediterranean, a 24-hour flight. Keep 19 would fly over large portions of the southeastern United States and the Atlantic Ocean, replicating the Chrome Dome route in every way they could, right down to the distance, the weight, and yes, the weapons they would carry.
What could possibly go wrong?
Crew R-10 would be led by Major Scott Tulloch, the pilot and aircraft commander. Tulloch was a World War II veteran who had flown everything from B-17s to B-29s to B-36s, and now he was behind the stick of the B-52. Captain Dick Rardin was the co-pilot, with the third pilot seat being taken by First Lieutenant Adam Maddox. Maddox came from the world of fighter pilots, having been reassigned to strategic bombing, something that was commonly happening at that time, a process jokingly described as being SACM-sized.
Nip the tip!
Maddox was also the only black pilot in the entire wing, something not uncommon back in the good old days. First Lieutenant Bill Wilson sat in the electronics warfare seat next to Sergeant Frank Barnish in the gunner seat. There was also Major Gene Shelton in the radar navigator seat and Captain Paul Brown, the navigator. The navigator could also rightly be called the bombardier, as most of the arming and aiming process was their purview.
No, that's wrong!
Finally, there was the instructor navigator seat, occupied by Major Eugene Richards, the second ride-along who was really only there to fulfill a flight time requirement to secure his flight pay for the month. But the IN seat could assist with any function the defense team needed, and Richards was by no means a worthless inclusion. Briefing and pre-flight went perfectly, and Keep 19 took off from Seymour Johnson Air Force Base at 10:56 a.m. on Monday, January 23, 1961. The flight was going exactly to plan, and before long, it was time to refuel. Mid-air refueling was an integral part of SAC's airborne alert mission, allowing the marathon flights that maintained the constant readiness required. The Air Force used the flying boom system, in which a hose running through a boom with wings is guided by an operator on the fuel tanker. The B-52 has a port in which the nozzle is inserted, requiring the pilot to maintain a near-perfect stabilizing maneuver to avoid detachment. This was no easy feat, and every SAC pilot tried their hardest to join the One Gulp Club, in which the B-52 receives all 120,000 pounds of fuel without needing to recouple with the tanker. The whole process took about 20 minutes, and by the time it was over, the B-52 pilot was usually sweating. The whole process was made even more difficult for two reasons. Number one, the B-52G relied entirely on spoilers for wing control rather than the more traditional ailerons. Ailerons look like little wings on the ends of the big wings that swing up and down to control the roll of the aircraft, while the G-model spoilers simply created drag to slow down one wing or the other. Spoilers were great for slowing down when used in unison, but they were slower to respond than ailerons, which made steadying during refuel very difficult. The second reason was a lack of radio communication between the KC-135 Strato tanker. This was by design, as radio waves could easily be intercepted while ostensibly near enemy territory. The whole process was meant to happen through strict procedure and visual cues. Despite the challenges involved, Tulloch, Rardin, and Maddox handled the first refueling without incident. The weather was nice and it was made during daylight. But now it was time to refuel again, and things had gotten a little dicier. Firstly, it was now 9 p.m. at night and dark out, and secondly, the weather had changed, with a cold front moving in causing turbulence and higher winds. Tulloch had disconnected from the tanker twice already when he broke free to an observation post to rest for a few moments. Once connected again, the first problems began to manifest. Maddox and Rardin were diligently observing the instrument panel during refueling, and Maddox noticed a slight drop in the No. 4 fuel tank. He announced the discrepancy, and Major Tulloch reset the gauge to see if it was a minor glitch. The gauge dropped to 0, then started to climb, just like it was supposed to, only it never climbed back to full. There was a leak. Major Tulloch broke radio silence and asked the tanker, codenamed Adel 57, to drop back behind them and look for a leak, only they couldn't see Keep 19 very well in the dark. He then called in to Seymour Johnson and requested a chase plane to try and track down the problem. Adel 57 retreated out of explosion distance, and Tulloch informed Seymour Johnson of the leak, which by now was a veritable torrent of fuel. Finally, Adel 57 was able to get a better look and determined that the leak was happening between the No. 3 engine pod and the fuselage, at the root of the right wing. Tulloch then turned the plane out to sea to avoid possible collateral damage and reported an emergency to the base. The wing commander was alerted, and the entire effort of the U.S. Air Force was now committed to getting the wounded bird down safely. The plan had been to fly circles over the ocean until the leak fully drained the tank, allowing for a safer landing. In the meantime, Sergeant Barnish was sent into the guts of the plane to check on the bombs. After waiting for the plane to depressurize, Barnish found that the bombs and the landing gear were absolutely soaked with jet fuel, and by the time he came out, he was too. This was a massive problem, as now any rogue spark could immolate the entire craft in one massive fireball. As such, Tulloch ordered the crew to shut down every solitary circuit that wasn't necessary to keep the plane airborne. Keep 19 would then attempt to pump fuel and transfer it around the plane to try and balance out the weight, only the fuel pumps were acting erratically. And if all that wasn't bad enough, the radio equipment started malfunctioning as well, threatening to cut Keep 19 off from the tower. This was the culmination of a series of electrical problems that had cropped up during the incident, and the wing commander felt it was time to bring them home. Tulloch argued that they needed to lose more fuel to reduce the danger during takeoff, but eventually he acquiesced and agreed to turn Keep 19 towards Seymour Johnson. The crew knew how dangerous their situation had become, and each man did his best to relax, to let their training take over, hoping their bird had enough flight left in her to take them home. Keep 19 crossed over Wrightsville Beach, now limping over dry land. It seemed for the moment that the plane was holding steady, and all the crew could do was pray that it would continue to do so.
The men in this aircraft knew they were violating almost every physiological limit in the book.
The crew on a B-52 communicates with each other over radio, keeping the commander up to date on all of their instruments and receiving whatever instructions needed from the cockpit. There is an entire lexicon of shorthand jargon used by those in aviation, but on a B-52, there were two words that no one was permitted to say, with the exception of the aircraft commander: bail out. During these fleeting moments over North Carolina, Crew R10 was quietly rehearsing the bailout procedure in their heads, hoping against hope they wouldn't hear those fateful words from Major Tulloch. The men without ejection seats likely felt a king-sized lump in their throats as they eyed the hatches they would need to rush through if the call went out. But their mission was still at hand, despite their growing fears, and it was time for their first hurdle in the landing process, lowering the landing gear. And thankfully, the wheels came down without blowing up the plane. Next, they would need to test the flaps, a necessity when landing with the extra fuel weight. Again, no problems. It seemed the electrical system was showing some mercy to Crew R10. As Keep 19 approached the airfield, Tulloch engaged the flaps and changed the heading from 320 degrees to 260 to line up with the runway. Keep 19 began its long, high-altitude approach, with the ground crews preparing to receive a wounded B-52. Once the flaps fully extended, the plane began to slow down further, and Tulloch executed the turn without a problem. But just when it seemed he might pull this landing off, there was a loud noise from the underside of the plane, causing it to jerk violently. Tulloch managed to steady the bird again, but then there was another loud noise from below, followed by a hard pull to the right. The pilot struggled to pull against the turn, with Major Tulloch rallying every scrap of knowledge he had gathered in his decades of flying. He yanked the power from every engine on the left wing and increased power to full on the right wing. The plane was losing airspeed, and Tulloch was trying frantically to bring the nose up. He was giving it everything he had when suddenly, an explosion. The right wing had sheared off of the fuselage, and Keep 19 was beginning to invert. This was it. Major Tulloch had just enough time to shout "bail out" into the intercom, followed by a second confirming order. Every man in an ejection seat pulled the lever, causing the hatches above or beneath to blast open, followed by a blast of compressed air that launched the crew into the night sky. Adam Maddox had been seated in his non-ejection seat at the time of the explosion, and during a controlled bailout, he would simply wait for the navigator to eject through the bottom of the plane, then leap through the hatch left behind. But Keep 19 was inverting fast, and all of that combustible fuel was about to engulf the plane in flames. Major Tulloch stole one last look at his third pilot, and Maddox gave his commander a nod as if to say, "It's okay." And Tulloch pulled his ejection lever, certain that he'd seen Maddox for the last time. But Maddox wasn't just going to give up. He leapt forward as the plane inverted, knowing full well he couldn't go down the lower hatch. He was aiming for the right hatch, but the force of the fall caused him to land in the left hatch. He was partially out of the plane with only his head and shoulders free, but now he was stuck. It looked like the end for him, but by some miracle, the inertiatic force of the inversion seemed to pop him out of the hatch. Adam Maddox was free of Keep 19. He deployed his chute and landed safely on the ground in Faro, North Carolina. Above him, the mighty B-52 disintegrated in a ball of flames. 8 parachutes deployed that night, but only 7 of them were attached to men. Maddox managed to hitch a ride back to Seymour Johnson, where, after some difficulty with an extremely zealous base security guard, he was able to alert the base of exactly what happened to Keep 19. Captain Rardin, the co-pilot, would eventually join Maddox after his own ordeal. All in all, 7 men landed in the fields and forests around Faro, but unfortunately, one of that 7 did not survive his ejection. Major Shelton was found caught up in a tree. His neck was broken. In addition to Major Shelton, Major Richards and Sergeant Barnish had also perished in the crash. It isn't known exactly what happened to those 3 men, but Maddox would later speculate that Richards had gotten free of the plane just like he had, but that he had succumbed to the same inertia that freed Maddox. Only for Richards, that force would have pulled him back into the plane, slamming his body against the ceiling. As for Shelton, Tulloch speculated that he likely had been helping Richards for too long, ejecting when it was too late to save himself. And lastly, and most puzzling, Frank Barnish was found still strapped into his ejection seat, with the lever only partially pulled. All 3 had left behind wives and children. For the men who survived the crash, it would be a short but painful struggle to seek out rescue amongst the farmers of Faro. The small village was rocked awake by the explosion, and to many in the rural population, it truly seemed like the end of the world. Roaring walls of flame erupted amongst the fields of Faro, and the volunteer firefighters sprang into action, plowing devil-may-care toward the largest blazes they could find. Before long, the Air Force firefighters would arrive and wrest control of the blazing jet fuel. Miraculously, no one on the ground was hurt, and the only damage sustained by local homes was a busted window and a scorched facade.
Well, lucky us.
At some time during the night's events, a pair of locals spotted a large object caught up in a clutch of trees. It was roughly 11 feet tall, standing nearly straight up amongst the gum trees. The locals reported this sighting to the Air Force, and before long it was confirmed. They had found bomb number 1, partially buried past the nose and scuffed by the crash, but largely intact. The bomb squad was called in, which consisted of a specialist, a highly classified checklist, and some assistants. The bomb was rendered safe without incident, and the husk of a weapon was shuttled safely to San Antonio, Texas for dismantling. Eventually, Bomb 2 was also found, at least partially, or I guess I should say they found where it landed. You see, Bomb number 2 fell out of Keep 19 just like its twin had, but unlike its twin, its parachute had not deployed. This meant that the multi-ton behemoth plummeted to the earth at speeds approaching Mach 1, smacking into the soft muddy field and burying itself deep into the earth. The salvage effort began, but it wasn't as simple as just digging straight down. Faro was right next to a swamp, and the earth around the bomb was soft and wet, meaning that for every foot they dug down, they would need to dig 4 feet out. By the time they got to the bulk of the wreckage, they had dug a veritable crater into the farmland. But thankfully, they did manage to find the main mass of the weapon, and remove the highly radioactive primary, a volleyball-like sphere of plutonium that constituted the bulk of the fissile material. They also discovered something incredibly scary at this point. Bomb number 2 showed that its main safety switch had been set to armed.
What the fuck?
The men in the hole were likely at full pucker at this point, but before long the primary was removed and the danger was fully averted. But not all of bomb number 2 had been salvaged. The secondary radioactive component had never been accounted for. This pill-shaped construct consisted of even more plutonium and a tritium bottle. This piece is thought to have rocketed out of the nose of the bomb, plowing to an astounding depth of 180 feet, well past the water table and well out of reach of the excavators. After struggling with water pumps to no avail, it was eventually decided that the secondary was of no real consequence, and the site was filled in and abandoned. The secondary presumably still slumbers in the earth to this day. The first question that needed to be answered here was how. How did this plane fail so catastrophically? The answer is actually quite simple in this case. Remember when I mentioned the problem of wet wings and the potential for metal fatigue? Well, that's exactly what happened with Keep 19. A massive crack had formed where the right wing meets the fuselage, and over the course of the flight, the crack grew larger and larger, big enough to dump 19 tons of fuel in just 2 minutes. The wing began to break free from the plane when Tulloch began landing procedures, and before long, it had sheared off the fuselage, and that was that. Unsurprisingly, the Air Force knew about this issue, and they had planned to correct it by refitting all of the G models in the fleet, but unfortunately, they had not known just how bad the stress problem had become. Later, Boeing would correct these flaws as a consequence of the events over Faro. Next was the question of nuclear safety. With one bomb having landed nearly intact and another having seemingly been armed when it dropped, how close did we actually come to an accidental nuclear detonation? Well, thankfully, not as close as it might seem from first glance. Let's start at the beginning. When it's time to deploy a nuke, the crew goes through a rigorous process of arming the weapon, removing remote safeties, and pulling an actual manual safety from the navigator's seat. Once this is done, a set of Wile E. Coyote-style plungers are free to shimmy loose from the slots in the bombs. If these plungers are broken off in any way, the bomb locks up and it will not arm. Finally, as the bomb begins its descent, the parachutes themselves are deployed in sequence, and if either chute malfunctions, the bomb will not detonate. This was designed to prevent early detonation that might destroy the bomber before it could escape to a safe distance. If all of these procedures are completed, you get a really big boom. If any of them are not completed, no boom. Now, obviously, none of the crew arming steps had been taken, but something really remarkable had happened. Likely because of the inversion, the plunger safety I mentioned before had been bypassed without breaking the poles. That's step 1 completed. Bomb 2 didn't deploy its chute, so that's a step missed, but Bomb 1 did, so that's step 2 done. Bomb 2 smashed into the earth and was made inert, but Bomb 1 landed safely just like it would during an attack. But thankfully, despite tripped safety switches, neither bomb had been armed, meaning that the master arm safe circuit had prevented Bomb 1 from detonating. Just one circuit prevented Faro, North Carolina from being completely annihilated. This whole affair was a big wake-up call for the US military, and the Sandia Laboratory set to work right away to make sure it never got that close again. More safety features would be implemented, such as PAL codes, which I discussed in the last Broken Arrow. But there is an axiom posited by some in the scientific world. Whatever is not forbidden in physics is compulsory. If the probability is not zero, it will eventually happen. Thankfully though, that day was not January 23rd, 1961. But if it had been, there is a very real possibility that it would have meant the start of World War III. Many speculate that due to the heightened tensions of the time period and the eagerness of SAC's commander, General Power, that an accidental detonation that close to a SAC base would have surely been mistaken for a Russian attack. Power had been LeMay's successor, but he made the old general look like a hippie by comparison. The man once said, "At the end of the war, if there are 2 Americans alive and 1 Russian, we win." So he was really just looking for an excuse to take on the enemy.
Annihilate! Kill! Kill! Kill!
And in the worst case scenario, he likely would have had his chance. This is because at the time, SAC's commander was one of 5 people with the authority to prosecute a nuclear war in the event of a Russian attack, with or without presidential approval. But thankfully, that never happened, leaving us all with merely another sobering reminder of how close we came to the end of the world. The people of Faro, North Carolina are no worse for wear these decades later, with the quiet community paying tribute to that harrowing night with a monument marking the event and honoring the fallen in the town of Eureka. In Faro itself, all that remains to remind the community of the event is a government easement that bans digging around the site of Bomb 2. Every year, the federal government sends a specialist to take samples of the soil to check for radioactive contamination at the site, but so far, no discrepancies have been found. But the half-life of plutonium is more than 20,000 years, and there has always been a persistent fear amongst some that the secondary from Bomb 2 might be lodged firmly in the water table, polluting the water supply downstream. No testing of the water around Faro has ever been done in earnest, and only time will tell of the possible repercussions of the event. When all is said and done, the Goldsboro Broken Arrow stands as a terrifying near-miss that likely would have been the most destructive nuclear accident in history, possibly the most destructive man-made accident in general. Thank you everybody for watching my 3rd Broken Arrow. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and a comment, and be sure to subscribe to my channel. It really helps me out. You can also check out my other Broken Arrows if you haven't yet, and I'd love it if you watch my last mini-doc on Reagan's Star Wars, the one with the lasers and stuff. My reach for that video got absolutely crushed by YouTube for some reason. I think because I waited a little longer than normal to post. So if you like my stuff, I'd love it if you checked it out. Anyway, stay tuned for more video essays, and I hope to see you all in the next one.